Hello dear listeners, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward. Perhaps you know me from Warm Pages as well. Before we begin, I'd love to hear about a hobby or small joy that brightened your week. Maybe knitting, gardening, reading, or listening to cosy mysteries like this one. Share your little joys with us, and don't forget to subscribe. Now get comfortable. Our story is about to begin. Chapter 1. The Bitter Frost and the Bad Heritage Consultant. The winter morning arrived in Loch Dubh with all the charm of a funeral shroud, wrapping the Highland village in a freezing fog that rolled off the black waters of the loch like something out of a particularly depressing Celtic legend. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, all 6 feet 3 inches of him, stood at the window of his kitchen in the police station, contemplating the absolutely essential task of doing precisely nothing. He was a gangling man with flaming red hair and hazel eyes that could look remarkably stupid when the occasion demanded it. This particular talent for appearing dim had saved him from promotion more times than he cared to count, and he was extremely fond of it. "Aye, lugs," he said to the dog at his feet, a strange-looking animal with a lugubrious expression and the oversized ears that had earned him his name. "It's far too cold for police work today." Lugs thumped his tail in wholehearted agreement, while Sonsi, Hamish's wildcat, merely opened one yellow eye from her position by the stove and went back to sleep. The wildcat had adopted Hamish some years back, or perhaps it was the other way around. Either way, she had brought a certain feral dignity to the police station that Hamish rather admired. He had just settled down with a cup of strong tea and was contemplating the merits of attending to his small flock of sheep versus pretending they did not exist for another day when the peace of his morning was shattered by the sound of a car engine. Not just any car engine, but the sort of expensive purr that spoke of London money and Highland ignorance in equal measure. Hamish sighed. Nothing good ever came in a car that cost more than a crofter's annual income. By the time he'd reluctantly pulled on his regulation boots and made his way to the door, a man had already emerged from the sleek black vehicle and was standing in the street, looking at Loch Dubh with the expression of someone who had just discovered something unpleasant on the bottom of their shoe. He was about 40, expensively dressed in the sort of country tweeds that screamed Savile Row rather than Scotland, with a florid face and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been properly contradicted. His eyes, small and sharp, swept over the village with unconcealed contempt. "You there?" the man called out, spotting Hamish. "Constable, is it? Julian Vane. I'm here on business regarding the Black House. I trust the locals have been informed of my arrival." "I wouldn't know about that," said Hamish mildly, in his soft Highland accent. "What business would that be?" Vane's expression suggested he found the question tedious in the extreme. "Heritage efficiency consultation. I've been hired by Lord Fairlie to assess the viability of the property. Frankly, from what I've seen so far, the whole structure should probably be condemned. However, there's potential for a luxury glamping experience if we strip out all the—" He waved a hand dismissively. "Primitive nonsense and install proper amenities." Hamish felt a small flame of dislike kindle in his chest. The Black House was one of the last remaining traditional dry stone dwellings in the area, a low, sturdy building that had weathered Highland storms for over 2 centuries. The villagers were fiercely proud of it. "Is that so?" he said, his voice still mild. "Quite so. I'll be examining the property tomorrow. In the meantime, I'll be staying at the hotel, such as it is." Vane wrinkled his nose. "I assume the plumbing functions?" "Most of the time," said Hamish. "Wonderful," Vane said with withering sarcasm. "Civilization at last." He climbed back into his car and drove off toward the Tommel Castle Hotel, leaving Hamish standing in the cold with a sense of impending doom settling over him like the freezing fog. By evening, word of Vane's arrival had spread through Loch Dubh with the speed of a particularly malicious piece of gossip. Hamish, yielding to the inevitable, made his way to the village pub where he found the locals in a state of high agitation. "Did you hear what he said?" demanded Archie MacLean, a small, wizened fisherman with a face like a dried apple. "He's going to turn the Black House into a glamping pod." "A glamping pod?" As if our heritage was some sort of joke for rich English folk to play at being Highland. "Aye, a glamping pod," echoed Archie's wife, a large woman with a voice that could strip paint. "The shame of it." Hamish accepted a dram of whiskey from the bartender and leaned against the bar, listening to the rising tide of outrage. Dr. Brodie, the local physician, was expounding on the historical significance of traditional Highland architecture. The Curry sisters, Nessie and Jessie, were taking turns repeating each other's indignation. Even the normally placid Reverend Wellington looked troubled. It was into this scene of barely controlled fury that Julian Vane made his second appearance of the day. He pushed through the door of the pub with all the subtlety of an invading army, thus surveyed the gathered villagers with barely concealed contempt, and announced in a carrying voice, "I do hope you're all not planning to make difficulties. The decision has been made. The Black House will be modernised, and if any of you have issues with that, I suggest you take them up with Lord Fairlie, though I should warn you, he's already signed the contracts." The silence that followed was so profound that Hamish could hear the peat fire crackling in the hearth. Then Archie MacLean stood up, his face purple with rage. "You cannae do that. That house has been standing for 200 years. It's part of our history." "Your history," said Vane, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "is primitive and unprofitable. Time to drag it into the 21st century. Don't you think?" Hamish saw Archie's hands clench into fists and move smoothly forward, placing himself between the fisherman and the Londoner with the practised ease of a man who had broken up more pub fights than he cared to remember. "Perhaps we could all discuss this calmly," he suggested. "There's nothing to discuss," said Vane. "I'm here to do a job, and I intend to do it. These people need to accept progress." It was at this moment that Mrs. Morag Menzies appeared at Vane's elbow, like a ministering angel in a cardigan. She was a soft-spoken woman in her late 50s, with gentle eyes, and the kind of permanent smile that suggested she had never had an unkind thought in her life. Now, she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the angry muttering. "I'm sure Mr. Vane doesn't mean to upset anyone. Perhaps you'd like some tea, Mr. Vane? And I've just baked fresh scones. Maybe we could all sit down and discuss this like civilised people." Vane looked at her as if she were something he'd found on the bottom of his expensive shoes, but Morag's smile never wavered. She simply continued to radiate gentle reasonableness until, with visible reluctance, Vane allowed himself to be guided to a table. The crisis for the moment was averted. The villagers subsided into angry muttering over their pints, while Morag fussed over Vane with tea and scones, her soft voice soothing the tension in the room. Hamish watched her thoughtfully. Morag Menzies was the village archivist, a volunteer at the Heritage Centre who knew more about local history than anyone else in Lochdoub. She was always the first to help in any crisis, always ready with tea and sympathy and a kind word, the very picture of Highland hospitality. He accepted a scone from her with thanks as she passed his table, and she smiled at him, that same gentle, unchanging smile. "I thought I'd bring some by the station tomorrow, Hamish," she said, "to keep the cold out." "That would be grand, Mrs. Menzies," he replied. She nodded and returned to her mission of keeping the peace, moving between the angry villagers and the oblivious Londoner with the grace of a woman who had spent her life smoothing troubled waters. Hamish finished his whiskey and headed home through the freezing fog, lugs trotting at his heels. Tomorrow, he thought, Julian Vane would visit the Black House. And tomorrow, knowing Lochdoub, there would be trouble. He had no idea how right he was. Chapter 2. A Sacrificial Discovery. Hamish woke the next morning to the sound of someone hammering on his door with the sort of urgency that suggested either fire, flood, or murder. Given that it was Lochdoub, murder seemed the most likely option. He pulled on his trousers and made his way downstairs, Lugs and Sonsey trailing behind him with the air of animals who felt that dawn disturbances were beneath their dignity. Archie MacLean stood on the doorstep, his face pale beneath its weathered tan. "You'd better come quick, Hamish," he said. "It's that Vane fellow. He's dead." "Dead drunk, you mean?" asked Hamish, though he already knew the answer from the look on Archie's face. Dead. in the Black House, his skulls bashed in. Hamish felt his stomach sink. So much for a peaceful winter. 20 minutes later, having driven through the freezing fog in the police Land Rover, Hamish stood in the doorway of the Black House and surveyed what was undoubtedly going to ruin his week, if not his entire month. Julian Vane lay sprawled on the earthen floor, his expensive tweeds soaked with blood that had pooled around his head in a dark, sticky mess. Beside him lay a heavy cast-iron peat cutter, one of the traditional tushkars that had been part of the heritage display. The business end was matted with blood and hair. Hamish's detective instincts, honed by years of solving crimes that everyone else thought were accidents or natural causes, immediately noted several things. First, the blow had been precise and powerful, catching Vane just above the left ear. Second, there were no signs of a struggle. And third, most puzzling of all, the heavy oak door of the Black House was bolted from the inside. He stepped carefully around the body, studying the room. The Black House was a low structure with thick stone walls and a roof of turf and thatch. Small windows, designed to keep out the Highland cold, let in only thin streams of grey morning light. The interior was furnished as it would have been 2 centuries ago, with a peat fire hearth, crude wooden furniture, and the various implements of crofting life displayed on the walls and in corners. There was only one door, and only one window large enough for a person to fit through, but that window was barred with iron rods and showed no signs of tampering. The floor was hard-packed earth that revealed no helpful footprints, though Hamish noted muddy boot prints near the entrance that led to the body and back out again. "Who found him?" he asked Archie, who had remained outside, looking distinctly green. "Dr. Brodie. He was out for his morning walk and saw the door standing open. Thought it was odd, so he looked inside. Where is he now?" "Gone back to his house to telephone Strathbane. Said you'd be wanting the detectives." Hamish suppressed a groan. The detectives from Strathbane meant Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a fat, whiskey-soaked bully who hated Hamish with a passion born of professional jealousy. Blair had spent years trying to prove that Hamish was either corrupt or incompetent, and had failed on both counts, which only made him hate Hamish more. "Right," said Hamish. "Nobody's to come in here until the detectives arrive. I'll stay and guard the scene." Archie nodded and scurried off with evident relief, leaving Hamish alone with the corpse and his thoughts. He spent the next hour carefully examining the scene without touching anything, noting every detail. The bolt on the door was solid and showed no signs of having been forced. The window bars were firmly set in the stone. There were no hidden passages, no trapdoors, no clever mechanisms that might explain how the killer had escaped from a locked room. Unless, of course, the killer had never left at all. Unless Vane had somehow bolted the door himself after being struck, which seemed unlikely given the severity of the head wound. Or unless someone else had bolted it from outside through some method Hamish had not yet discovered. He was still puzzling over this when the sound of car engines announced the arrival of the Strathbane contingent. Detective Chief Inspector Blair emerged from the first car like a malevolent whale breaching, his bloated face already red with exertion and temper. Behind him came Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, a foxy-faced man who was Blair's long-suffering second-in-command and several uniformed constables. "Well, well," said Blair, surveying Hamish with undisguised glee. "Another body on your patch, Macbeth. Starting to look like you're either unlucky or incompetent, maybe both." "The body's inside, sir," said Hamish mildly. "Victim is Julian Vane, heritage consultant from London. Appears to have been struck with a peat cutter sometime during the night." Blair pushed past him into the Black House, took one look at the corpse, and immediately began barking orders at the constables. Hamish stepped back and let him get on with it. He was knowing from long experience that Blair was at his most dangerous when he thought he was being clever. Jimmy Anderson drifted over to Hamish's side and lit a cigarette. "Locked room, is it?" he asked quietly. "Bolted from the inside," confirmed Hamish. "No other way in or out that I can see." Jimmy whistled softly. "That'll put Blair in a mood. He hates complicated." "Aye, well, he'll probably arrest the first person who looks at him sideways and call it solved." "Probably," agreed Jimmy, with the weary acceptance of a man who had watched Blair do exactly that on numerous occasions. By mid-morning, the Black House was swarming with scene-of-crime officers, photographers, and the police surgeon, who pronounced Vane very thoroughly dead and estimated the time of death at somewhere between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. Hamish stood outside watching the circus and wishing he were back at the station with a cup of tea and his feet up by the fire. It was then that Mrs. Morag Menzies appeared, carrying a large thermos and a basket. "I thought the poor detectives might need something hot to drink," she said, her soft voice barely carrying over the wind. "And I've brought some scones. It's terrible, just terrible what's happened. That poor man." She didn't sound particularly sincere about the poor man part, but then nobody in Lochdoub was likely to mourn Julian Vane very deeply. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Menzies," said Hamish, accepting a cup of hot coffee gratefully. "It's the least I can do. I've also prepared a list for the inspector," she added, producing a neatly written sheet of paper from her pocket. "All the people that Mr. Vane had words with yesterday. I thought it might be helpful." Hamish glanced at the list. It was thorough, detailed, and included the exact nature of each argument. Archie McLean was at the top, having threatened to punch Vane in the nose. Dr. Brodie was second, having been overheard arguing heatedly with the dead man about medical ethics. There were half a dozen other names, each with careful notations. "Very helpful indeed," said Hamish, though something about the list troubled him in a way he couldn't quite define. Morag smiled her gentle smile and went to distribute coffee to the Strathbane detectives, who accepted it with the gracelessness of men who considered kindness to be a sign of weakness. Blair emerged from the Black House looking triumphant. "Right," he announced. I want everyone who had contact with the victim yesterday brought in for questioning, starting with that fisherman McLean. Big muddy boot prints by the body, and McLean's got a pair of Wellingtons that'll match, I'll wager." "Archie McLean found the body, sir," Hamish pointed out. "Of course his boot prints would be there." "Don't you tell me how to run an investigation, Macbeth," snapped Blair. "I've solved more murders than you've had hot dinners. The fisherman had motive, he had opportunity, and once forensics matches those prints, we'll have him banged to rights." He stomped off toward his car, already reaching for his mobile phone to call for a warrant. Jimmy Anderson lingered behind. "He's going to make a mess of this," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Aye," said Hamish, "but maybe that's not such a bad thing. Gives me time to poke about on my own." "Just don't get caught poking," advised Jimmy. "Blair's gunning for you, as usual." "When is he not?" Jimmy grinned and followed his superior back to the cars. Hamish stood for a moment, looking at the Black House, a locked room, a hated victim, a village full of people with motives, and somewhere in the middle of it all the truth, waiting to be uncovered by a lazy Highland constable who would much rather be feeding his sheep. He sighed, finished his coffee and headed back to the station to begin what he did best, ignoring official procedure and following his instincts. Behind him, Morag Menzies packed up her empty thermos and basket, her face serene, her movements unhurried. She paused at the door of the Black House, looking in at the blood-stained floor where Julian Vane had met his end. And for just a moment something flickered across her gentle features. Then it was gone, and she was just Mrs. Menzies again, soft-spoken and kind, heading back to the Heritage Centre to catalogue old documents and preserve the village's history. As she always had, as she always would. Chapter 3. Sifting the Highland Gossip. The arrest of Archie McLean happened with all the subtlety of a Viking raid, which was to say that Blair descended upon the fisherman's cottage at dawn the following morning with 3 constables, 2 reporters he'd tipped off in advance, and an expression of vindictive triumph that would have done credit to a Roman emperor. Hamish heard about it from Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, who telephoned the station at 7 in the morning with the news delivered in tones of profound outrage. "That awful man from Strathbane has arrested poor Archie," she announced. "Dragged him out in handcuffs in front of the whole village. The shame of it. And everyone knows Archie couldn't hurt a fly except when his wife's nagging him. And even then he just hides in the pub cellar." "Did Blair say why he arrested him?" asked Hamish, though he already knew the answer. "Something about boot prints and forensic evidence. Load of nonsense, if you ask me. You need to do something, Hamish." "I'll do what I can," promised Hamish, and rang off before Mrs. Wellington could work herself into a proper sermon. He fed lugs and sonsy, pulled on his uniform and considered his options. Blair would be feeling smug and superior, having made his headline-grabbing arrest. The newspapers would run with it, the superintendent would congratulate him, and an innocent man would sit in a cell while the real killer walked free. It was, Hamish reflected, a typical Blair investigation. The solution, as always, was to conduct his own inquiry while Blair congratulated himself. And the first step was to gather intelligence from the village's most reliable sources of gossip. The Curry sisters lived in a neat cottage on the edge of the village, where they spent their days watching the comings and goings of Lochdoub with the dedication of Emi 6 operatives. They were twins, though Nessie was marginally the larger, and Jessie had a habit of repeating everything her sister said, like an enthusiastic echo. Hamish found them in their front room, knitting identical cardigans and peering out the window with twin expressions of avid interest. "Hamish Macbeth," said Nessie, putting down her needles. Come in. I suppose you'll hear about the murder." "The murder?" echoed Jessie. "I am that," said Hamish, accepting the inevitable cup of tea and settling into their chintz-covered sofa. "I was wondering if you'd seen anything unusual the day before Mr. Vane died." The sisters exchanged meaningful glances. "Well," said Nessie, leaning forward conspiratorially, "we did see that Vane man arguing with someone down by the harbour. Around 4 in the afternoon it was." 4 in the afternoon, confirmed Jessie. "Could you see who it was?" asked Hamish. "A younger man, smartly dressed. From Edinburgh, by the look of him. City shoes, you know. Not suitable for the Highlands at all." "Not suitable at all." They were having quite the row, lots of arm-waving from the young fellow. Vane looked angry, but then, he always looked angry. "Always angry," agreed Jessie with satisfaction. Hamish made a note. A younger man from Edinburgh was an interesting development. Anything else? "Doctor. Brodie was in quite a state that evening," offered Nessie. "We saw him pacing outside the surgery looking like he'd had bad news." Bad news. And Morag Menzies was up at the Black House earlier in the day, before Vane arrived. Saw her going in with her keys. She volunteers there, you know, keeping the place tidy. Keeping it tidy? This was also interesting, though not particularly surprising. Morag was responsible for maintaining the heritage site. Hamish finished his tea, thanked the sisters, and made his way to his next source of information. Angus MacDonald lived in a cottage that seemed to lean into the wind, as if bracing itself against the elements. He was ancient, possibly immortal, and claimed to have the gift of second sight. Hamish, who was practical to his bones, knew that Angus had no more psychic ability than lugs, but he did have an extensive network of informants and a talent for knowing things he shouldn't. The old man was sitting by his peat fire when Hamish arrived, smoking a pipe that smelled of old socks and contemplating the flames with the air of a man communing with the spirits. "I've been expecting you," he said without turning round. "I'm sure you have," said Hamish dryly. "Since half the village has probably been here this morning telling you about the murder." Angus cackled. "Aye, well, the spirits work in mysterious ways. Sit yourself down, Hamish. I've something to tell you about your dead Englishman." Hamish sat, watching the old fraud with wary amusement. "He wasn't just here about the Black House," said Angus. "Word is he'd been making inquiries about land deeds and property rights. Asking questions at the county office in Strathbane. Very specific questions about who owned what and when they'd acquired it." "How do you know that?" "My cousin's daughter works in the records office. Says Vane spent 2 days going through old documents before he came to Lochdoub. Made photocopies of everything." This was genuinely useful information. Hamish filed it away for future consideration. "Anything else?" "The spirits say you should look to the past," intoned Angus, resuming his mystic act. "The answer lies in what was, not what is." "The spirits are being deliberately cryptic again," observed Hamish. "They're spirits. It's what they do." Hamish left Angus to his dramatics and headed into Strathbane, where he had one more source to tap. Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson was not exactly a source in the traditional sense, but he was a friend of sorts, and he could be persuaded to share official information when properly motivated. The proper motivation in Jimmy's case was whiskey. Hamish found him in his office, looking harassed and drinking coffee that smelled like it had been brewed sometime during the previous administration. "Hamish," said Jimmy, with the relief of a drowning man spotting a lifeboat, "please tell me you've come to rescue me from Blair's latest triumph." Is he still crowing about arresting Archie? Crowing doesn't begin to cover it. He's planning a press conference. The superintendent's delighted, and I'm stuck writing up the case file even though we both know Archie didn't do it. The boot prints? Match Archie's Wellingtons perfectly. Of course they do. He found the body. But try telling Blair that. Hamish produced a flask from his jacket pocket. "I brought you something for your coffee." Jimmy's eyes lit up. "You're a saint, Hamish Macbeth. A Highland saint." While Jimmy improved his coffee with a generous measure of single malt, Hamish leaned against the desk in a casual manner that suggested he was merely making conversation. "I don't suppose you've got a copy of the autopsy report yet?" "Came in this morning. Single blow to the head, precisely placed. Death would have been instantaneous. No defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. Whoever did it caught him completely by surprise." "Time of death?" "Between 10 at night and 2 in the morning, give or take. Vane was last seen leaving the hotel around 9:30. Said he was going for a walk to inspect the Black House one more time before writing his report." "And nobody saw him after that?" "Not a soul. Or at least nobody's admitting to it." Jimmy took an appreciative sip of his enhanced coffee. "There's something else, though. The scene of crime boys found traces of some kind of adhesive on the murder weapon. Not blood or tissue, but a yellowish residue. They've sent it off for analysis." Hamish filed this away as well. Adhesive was an odd detail. "What about the locked door?" Jimmy shrugged. "Blair's theory is that Archie panicked and bolted it from outside somehow, then pretended to discover the body the next morning. Never mind that there's no evidence of tampering with the bolt mechanism, and no explanation for how it would even be possible. Blair doesn't let evidence get in the way of a good arrest. Never has, never will." Jimmy finished his coffee and looked at Hamish with something approaching sympathy. "You're going to solve this, aren't you? And then Blair's going to take the credit and you're going to let him." "If it keeps an innocent man out of prison," said Hamish mildly. "You're a better man than I am, Hamish Macbeth." "I'm a lazier man, Jimmy. There's a difference." Hamish left Strathbane with considerably more information than he'd arrived with. A younger man from Edinburgh arguing with Vane. Dr. Brodie in a state of agitation. Vane researching property deeds and land rights. And traces of adhesive on the murder weapon. Pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. He drove back to Lochdoub through the freezing fog, his mind working through possibilities. The locked door still bothered him. It was the sort of detail that didn't fit with a crime of passion. Locked rooms suggested premeditation, planning, a killer who had thought things through. As he pulled up outside the police station, he saw Morag Menzies coming down the path, carrying another basket. "More scones, Mrs. Menzies?" he asked, climbing out of the Land Rover. "I thought you might be hungry, working so hard on this terrible business," she said, her smile as gentle as ever. "Have you made any progress?" "Early days yet," said Hamish noncommittally. "I do hope they've got the right man with poor Archie, though I can't imagine him doing such a thing. He's always been so peaceable. Blair seems convinced." "Well, the inspector must know what he's doing." Morag handed over the basket. "I'll let you get on with your work. Do let me know if there's anything I can do to help." She walked away toward the Heritage Centre, her sensible shoes crunching on the frozen ground. Hamish carried the scones inside, fed one to Lugs, and sat down to think. Somewhere in the tangle of gossip and evidence there was a thread that would lead him to the truth. He just had to find it. And he had a feeling that when he did, it would surprise everyone, including himself. Chapter 4. The Blackmailer's Ledger. The autopsy report, when Hamish finally acquired a complete copy through means he preferred not to examine too closely, confirmed what Jimmy had already told him. A single, devastating blow from the cast-iron peat cutter, delivered with enough force to crack the skull, but wielded with surgical precision. The killer had known exactly where to strike. What the report also revealed, buried in the technical jargon, was that Vane had eaten dinner at the hotel around 8 o'clock and had consumed approximately 3 glasses of wine. Not enough to impair him significantly, but enough to slow his reflexes. The killer had chosen their moment well. Hamish sat at his kitchen table, studying the document by lamplight while Lugg snored at his feet, and Sonsi watched him with unblinking yellow eyes from her perch on the windowsill. Outside, another freezing fog had settled over Lochdoub, turning the world into a monochrome painting. The locked door continued to nag at him like a sawtooth. He'd been back to the Black House twice now, examining the bolt mechanism, the windows, the very stones of the walls. There was no trick to it, no hidden method. The door had been bolted from inside and there was no other way out, which meant either the killer had supernatural powers or Hamish was missing something obvious. He decided to go back for a third look. The Black House stood dark and silent in the fog, wrapped in police tape that fluttered in the bitter wind. Hamish ducked under it and let himself in with the key he'd borrowed from the evidence locker, another borrowing that wouldn't bear close scrutiny. Inside, the air still held the faint, coppery smell of old blood despite the scene of crime officers' thorough work. Hamish lit his torch and began a methodical search, moving slowly through the space, examining everything with fresh eyes. The peat fire hearth dominated one wall, a massive structure of fitted stones with an iron grate. The traditional furniture sat exactly as it had been arranged for the heritage display. Agricultural tools hung from pegs. A spinning wheel stood in one corner. Everything authentic, everything preserved exactly as it would have been 2 centuries ago. Hamish ran his hands along the stones of the hearth, feeling for loose mortar, hidden catches, and anything that might explain the impossible. His fingers found a slight irregularity in one of the stones about 3 feet above the floor. He pushed, and the stone moved. Behind it was a small cavity, and inside the cavity was a metal cash box. "Well now," murmured Hamish. The box wasn't locked. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat handwriting. Hamish carried it to the window where the grey morning light was stronger and began to read. What he found made his blood run cold. Julian Vane hadn't been just a heritage consultant. He'd been a predator of the most calculating kind. The ledger detailed a scheme of elegant cruelty. Vane would research property deeds and land records, find inconsistencies or long-forgotten debts, and then use that information to blackmail the property owners. You sign over your land for a fraction of its value, or face expensive legal action over claims that might or might not hold up in court. Most people couldn't afford to fight, so they signed. The ledger listed properties across Scotland, each with careful notes about the leverage Vane had used. And there, on one of the recent pages, were entries for Lochdoub, Archie MacLean's harbour shed, built on land that technically belonged to the estate, not to Archie. Vane had threatened legal action unless Archie paid an extortionate fee. Dr. Brodie, a malpractice case from 15 years ago that Vane had somehow unearthed, threatening to send the details to the medical board unless the doctor signed over a piece of valuable shorefront property. There were others, the Curry sisters, the Reverend Wellington, even old Angus MacDonald. Vane had collected secrets the way some men collected stamps, and he'd been preparing to use them all. Hamish felt his dislike of the dead man crystallise into something harder. This went beyond being an unpleasant person. This was systematic exploitation. He was photographing the relevant pages with his mobile phone when he heard a sound outside. Footsteps, crunching on frozen ground. Hamish slipped the ledger back into its hiding place and moved to the window. A figure was approaching through the fog, someone who moved with familiarity through the gloom. As they drew closer, Hamish recognised Dr. Brodie. The doctor was carrying a burlap sack. Hamish stepped outside, blocking the doctor's path. "Out for a walk, Dr. Brodie?" The doctor jumped like a startled rabbit, the sack swinging. "Hamish, good Lord! You gave me a fright! What's in the sack? It's nothing to do with the murder." "I'll be the judge of that. Open it, please." Dr. Brody's shoulders sagged in defeat. He opened the sack, and Hamish found himself looking at the remains of a large salmon, its silver scales catching what little light penetrated the fog. "Poaching?" asked Hamish. "I found it in one of the illegal nets down by the river," said Dr. Brody miserably. "I know I shouldn't have taken it, but with everything that's happened, I thought I'd dispose of it before the water bailiff found it. My wife would be mortified if there was a scandal." Hamish studied the doctor's face. The man looked exhausted and frightened, but not like a murderer. More like someone who had made a small, stupid mistake and was terrified of the consequences. "Where were you between 10 at night and 2 in the morning when Vane was killed?" "Playing whist with Reverend Wellington and his wife. We didn't finish until well past midnight. You can ask them." "I will," said Hamish. He looked at the salmon, then back at the doctor. "Bury that thing deep and don't let me catch you poaching again. And if your wife asks, you were checking on a patient." The doctor's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Hamish. Go on with you before I change my mind." Dr. Brody scurried off into the fog, clutching his contraband fish. Hamish returned to the black house and retrieved the ledger, wrapping it carefully in a plastic evidence bag. This changed everything. Every person Vane had targeted was now a suspect with a powerful motive. The pool had just expanded from a few villagers to half of Loch Dubh. He was locking the door when his mobile phone rang. It was Jimmy Anderson. "Hamish, we've got a problem." "Well, you've got a problem. Blair's just discovered that the mysterious Edinburgh man the Curry sisters mentioned is Callum Vane, the victim's nephew. He's been in the area for 3 days, staying at a bed and breakfast in Strathbane. And here's the interesting part. Julian Vane's will leaves everything to Callum. How much is everything? Close to £2 million, including property. Callum's also got gambling debts up to his eyeballs. Blair's bringing him in for questioning now." Hamish thanked Jimmy and rang off. A nephew with debts and an inheritance. That was a motive with teeth. He drove back to the station, his mind spinning through possibilities. The ledger sat on the seat beside him. A catalogue of secrets and lies. Somewhere in those pages was the key to understanding who had killed Julian Vane and why. But first he needed to verify alibis and check timelines. The methodical, boring work of detection that Blair always rushed through in his eagerness for arrests. As Hamish pulled up outside the station, he saw Morag Menzies waiting on the doorstep, another basket in her hands. Did the woman ever stop baking? "Mrs. Menzies," he said, climbing out of the Land Rover. "I brought you some soup, Hamish. You looked peaky this morning, and I thought you might not be eating properly with all this terrible business going on." "That's very kind," said Hamish, accepting the basket. "You're always thinking of others." "It's what we do in the Highlands," she said simply. "Look after each other." "Especially in hard times." She smiled her gentle smile and walked away, leaving Hamish with the soup and the nagging feeling that he was missing something important. Something about Morag. Something about the way she always seemed to appear at exactly the right moment with exactly the right thing. He carried the soup inside, fed lugs, and sat down with the ledger once more. The answer was in here somewhere. He just had to find it. Chapter 5. Expanding the suspect pool. Callum Vane turned out to be everything his uncle had been, minus 30 years and plus a veneer of Edinburgh sophistication that fooled absolutely nobody. He arrived at the Strathbane police station in a BMW he couldn't afford, wearing a suit that screamed expense account, and with the sort of arrogant slouch that suggested he thought the whole business beneath him. Hamish, who had invited himself to observe the interview by the simple expedient of appearing in the observation room with 2 cups of coffee for Jimmy Anderson, watched through the one-way glass as Blair went to work. "So, Mr. Vane," Blair began, settling his bulk into the interview chair with evident satisfaction. "Care to explain why you didn't mention you were in the area when your uncle was murdered?" Callum lit a cigarette, ignoring the no-smoking signs with the casual contempt of someone who had spent his life ignoring inconvenient rules. "I wasn't aware I was obliged to report my whereabouts to the local constabulary. I was visiting on business." "Business with your uncle?" "Among others." Witnesses say you had a blazing row with Julian Vane the afternoon before he died. We had a discussion about family matters. Hardly unusual. What kind of family matters? Callum took a long drag on his cigarette. If you must know, I was asking my uncle for a loan. He refused. We argued. I left. End of story. How much did you need? That's my affair. Blair leaned forward, his face going red. When a man's murdered, and his nephew's in debt up to his eyeballs and stands to inherit £2 million, that becomes police business. For the first time, and something flickered across Callum's face. Not guilt exactly, but calculation. I admit the timing is fortunate, but I didn't kill Uncle Julian. I was nowhere near Lochdoub that night. Prove it. Callum smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. I was in Strathbane, having dinner at the Royal Hotel. I arrived at 7, had a meal that lasted until nearly 10, then went to a nightclub called The Cellar. Didn't leave until they closed at 3 in the morning. I can provide you with credit card receipts, CCTV footage, and the names of approximately a dozen witnesses who saw me there if you'd like. Hamish watched Blair's face go from red to purple. An alibi that's solid would take days to break, if it could be broken at all. We'll be checking every detail, Blair blustered. I expect nothing less, said Callum smoothly. Now, unless you're planning to charge me, I have a funeral to arrange. In the observation room, Jimmy Anderson shook his head. He's a piece of work, but he's telling the truth about the alibi. We've already pulled the CCTV from the traffic cameras. His car was in Strathbane all night. So we're back to the locals, said Hamish. Looks like it. Which means Blair's going to redouble his efforts to pin it on Archie. Hamish drove back to Lochdoub through sheets of icy rain that had replaced the fog, his windscreen wipers battling a losing war against the elements. The suspect pool had expanded and contracted simultaneously. Callum Vane had motive but no opportunity. The villagers had opportunity but their motives, while genuine, seemed almost too obvious. Unless the blackmail ledger had revealed something more specific. Something personal enough to drive someone to murder. He spent the afternoon methodically checking alibis, moving through the village with the persistence of water finding its way downhill. The Curry sisters had been at home watching television. The Reverend Wellington confirmed Dr. Brodie's card game alibi, though he seemed uncomfortable about it, which Hamish attributed to the doctor's salmon-related guilt. Archie McLean's alibi was both perfect and damning. He'd spent the entire evening hiding in the pub cellar, avoiding his wife's wrath over some domestic transgression Hamish didn't particularly want to know about. The landlord confirmed it, as did the barman, but neither had actually seen Archie after 9:30 when he descended into the cellar. He could theoretically have slipped out the back door, committed murder, and returned without being noticed. Theoretically. But Hamish knew Archie. The fisherman was capable of many things, most of them involving creative approaches to fishing regulations, but cold-blooded murder wasn't among them. More importantly, Archie wasn't clever enough to have managed the locked room trick. That required planning, intelligence, a certain ruthless creativity. Hamish was contemplating this over a late supper of Morag soup, which was excellent despite his growing unease about its provider when his phone rang. "Hamish, it's Angela Brodie." The doctor's wife sounded distressed. "I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but I've just found something rather odd. Could you come over?" The Brodies lived in a neat house overlooking the loch, all chintz curtains and tidy gardens. Angela met him at the door, wringing her hands. "I feel absolutely awful about this, but I was tidying John's study and I found a letter from Julian Vane. It's horrible, Hamish. Simply horrible." She handed him an envelope. Inside was a typed letter on expensive stationery, dated 3 days before Vane's death. Hamish read it with growing anger. Vane had indeed discovered the details of Dr. Brodie's old malpractice case, a tragedy involving a misdiagnosed appendicitis 15 years ago. The letter demanded the transfer of a valuable piece of property within 1 week, or Vane would send a full report to the General Medical Council, ensuring Dr. Brodie's career would end in disgrace. "John didn't tell me," said Angela, tears in her eyes. "He must have been carrying this alone. Hamish, you don't think—" "No, said Hamish firmly. "I don't. Doctor. Brodie was playing cards with the minister. I've checked. But he could have left. He could have, but he didn't. Trust me on this, Angela." He left her somewhat comforted and drove to the manse, where Reverend Wellington confirmed the timeline once more. The card game had started at 8 and continued until 12:30. Dr. Brodie had been there the entire time, never leaving except to use the bathroom once around 11. He seemed preoccupied, the minister admitted, but I thought it was just the usual stress of country practice. Hamish thanked him and returned to the station, where he spread out his notes and began to construct a timeline. Julian Vane had left the hotel at 9:30, telling the receptionist he was going to inspect the Black House one final time. His body had been discovered at 7 the next morning by Dr. Brodie, time of death, between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. Archie McLean, in the pub cellar, no solid alibi after 9:30. Dr. Brodie, playing cards, solid alibi. Callum Vane, in Strathbane, ironclad alibi. The Curry sisters, Reverend Wellington, the various other villagers Vane had targeted, all at home, no witnesses, no alibis that couldn't be broken. And yet none of them felt right. The murder had been too precise, too calculated. This wasn't a crime of passion committed by an angry villager. This was something colder. Hamish sat back and looked at Sonsi, who was watching him with her usual inscrutability. "I'm missing something," he told the cat. "Something obvious." Sonsi yawned, displaying impressive fangs, and went back to sleep. Hamish picked up the blackmail ledger and began reading through it again, page by page, looking for the detail that would make everything clear. The names, the properties, the amounts demanded. Vane had been systematic in his cruelty, documenting everything with the thoroughness of an accountant. It was on the third read-through that he noticed it. A small notation in the margin of one entry, in different ink. A single word followed by a question mark. Menzies. Hamish stared at it, feeling pieces click into place like tumblers in a lock. Morag Menzies. Always helpful. Always there. Always the first to provide information, to offer comfort, to guide the investigation in subtle ways. He thought about the list she'd given Blair, so perfectly timed to cast suspicion on the other villagers. The way she'd been at the Black House before Vane arrived that final day. Her position as village archivist with access to all the historical records. The adhesive residue on the murder weapon. The kind of adhesive used to preserve old documents. Hamish stood up so quickly that Luggs yelped in surprise. He needed to dig into Morag Menzies' past, and he needed to do it quickly. Chapter 6, False Trails and Poached Fish. The problem with investigating Morag Menzies, Hamish quickly discovered, was that she had lived in Lochdu for over 20 years, and was universally beloved. Suggesting to anyone that she might be involved in murder would be like accusing the Queen of shoplifting. He started with the County Records Office in Strathbane, where a helpful clerk who owed him a favour from a previous case let him search through the old files. Birth certificates, marriage licences, property transfers, the paper trail of ordinary life. Morag had moved to Lochdu in 2003, taking up the position of volunteer archivist at the Heritage Centre. Before that, there was a gap. No employment records, no previous addresses in Scotland. It was as if she'd materialised fully formed from the Highland mist. "Looking for anything in particular?" asked the clerk, peering over his shoulder. "Background on Morag Menzies. Maiden name, previous addresses, that sort of thing." The clerk frowned thoughtfully. "Menzies? That's odd. I remember her coming in to register as a voter when she first moved here. She had to provide documentation, of course. Let me check the archives." He disappeared into the back room and emerged 20 minutes later with a dusty file. "Here we are. Morag Campbell Menzies. Previous address listed as Fort William. Before that, things get fuzzy. There's a note here that she changed her name by deed poll in 2002. Original name was Morag Campbell MacLeish." MacLeish. The name rang a distant bell in Hamish's memory, something connected to Lochdube's history. He made a note to pursue it further. He was driving back to the village when his phone rang. It was Dr. Brodie, sounding agitated. "Hamish, I need to see you. It's urgent." "I'm on my way back now. Meet me at the station in 20 minutes. Dr. Brodie was pacing outside the police station when Hamish arrived, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. "Come in," said Hamish. "Sit down before you wear a hole in the ground." The doctor collapsed into a chair, running his hands through his hair. "I can't do this any more, Hamish. The guilt is eating me alive." Hamish felt his stomach drop. What guilt would that be? "I lied about the card game. Well, not exactly lied. But I wasn't there the whole time. I left around 11, said I needed to check on a patient. But there was no patient." "Where did you go?" Dr. Brodie looked at him miserably. "The Black House." I'd decided to confront Vane, to try to reason with him about the blackmail, but when I got there, the place was dark and the door was locked. I knocked, but nobody answered. I assumed he wasn't there, so I left and went back to the manse. Got back around 11:30, and the Reverend never even noticed I'd been gone for more than a few minutes. "Did you see anyone else near the Black House?" "Not a soul. The fog was thick as porridge. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me." Hamish studied the doctor's face. The man was clearly terrified, but he didn't have the look of a murderer, more the look of someone who'd made a foolish decision and was now panicking about the consequences. "You didn't tell me this before because I thought it would make me look guilty. And then when Archie was arrested, I thought the whole thing would blow over. But I can't sleep, Hamish. Every time I close my eyes, I see that letter from Vane." "What time did you arrive at the Black House?" "Just after 11. And I swear on my medical licence the place was locked up tight. If Vane was in there, he didn't answer when I knocked." This created a new timeline problem. If Dr. Brodie was telling the truth, and Hamish was inclined to believe he was, then Vane was either already dead by 11 o'clock or was alive but ignoring visitors. Either way, it narrowed the window of opportunity. "Right," said Hamish. "Here's what you're going to do. You're going to go home, you're going to get some sleep, and you're going to stop torturing yourself. You didn't kill anyone." "How can you be sure?" "Because I know you, John Brodie. And I know what a killer looks like." After the doctor left, somewhat comforted but still looking haggard, Hamish sat down to reconsider his timeline. If Vane had been alive at 11, that put the murder between 11 and 2 in the morning, a narrower window than the autopsy had suggested. He was mulling this over when there was a knock at the door. This time it was Archie McLean's wife, a formidable woman built like a Highland cow and with roughly the same temperament. "Hamish Macbeth, you need to do something about getting my Archie released. That fat fool from Strathbane has him locked up for something he didn't do, and I'll not stand for it." "I'm working on it, Mrs. McLean. Work faster. I need him home. The gutters are leaking and the sheep need shearing." She stomped off, leaving Hamish with a renewed sense of urgency. Blair was planning to charge Archie formally within 48 hours. After that, it would be much harder to prove his innocence. That evening, Hamish decided to return to the Black House one more time. Something about Dr. Brodie's story bothered him. The doctor had knocked on a locked door at 11 o'clock, but the murder had happened sometime that night, and the door had been bolted from the inside, which meant either the killer was inside with Vane when Dr. Brodie knocked, or they arrived after the doctor left. The Black House looked even more forbidding in the darkness, a low black shape against the slightly less black sky. Hamish let himself in and stood in the doorway, trying to imagine the scene. Vane arrives around 9:30 or 10. He's alone inspecting the building one last time. At some point, someone else arrives. They strike him down with the peat cutter. Then they bolt the door from inside and somehow escape, leaving a locked room mystery. But how? Hamish examined the bolt mechanism again, this time with a torch and a magnifying glass borrowed from the evidence kit. The bolt was solid iron, simple and medieval in its efficiency. It could only be operated from inside, unless... He knelt down and examined the gap between the door and the frame. It was narrow, but not impossibly so. With a piece of string and patience, someone could theoretically manipulate the bolt from outside, but there were no scratches on the metal, no signs that anyone had tried. He was about to give up when his torch beam caught something wedged in the crack of the doorframe barely visible. a tiny scrap of paper yellowed with age. Hamish extracted it carefully with a pair of tweezers. It was vellum, the kind used in old documents, and it had traces of the same adhesive the crime scene technicians had found on the murder weapon. Archival adhesive, the kind Morag Menzies used every day in her work at the Heritage Centre. Hamish stood in the darkness, the scrap of vellum in his hand, and felt the case begin to crystallise around him like ice forming on a winter loch. Morag Menzies, changed her name from MacLeish, had access to the Black House, used archival materials that matched the forensic evidence, and had been systematically helpful in a way that had steered the investigation away from herself and toward the other villagers. He needed to find out who Morag MacLeish had been before she became Morag Menzies, and he needed to do it before Blair charged the wrong man with murder. He locked up the Black House, pocketed the vellum carefully, and drove back to the station through the freezing rain. Lugs greeted him with enthusiasm, while Sonsey merely opened one eye and went back to sleep. Hamish made himself a cup of tea and pulled out his laptop. It was time to dig into the past, and in the past he suspected he would find the truth. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. The Highland winter dawn came late and reluctant, as if the sun itself couldn't be bothered with the effort. Hamish had been awake most of the night, searching through online archives and newspaper databases, following the trail of Morag MacLeish backward through time. What he found was a tragedy buried in the mundane language of business failures and legal proceedings. In 1985, a property developer named Geoffrey Vane, father of the recently deceased Julian, had partnered with Donald MacLeish in a commercial venture involving Highland land purchases. The partnership had collapsed spectacularly when Vane systematically cheated MacLeish out of his share, using legal loopholes and creative accounting. MacLeish lost everything, including his ancestral home. The ancestral home being the building now known as the Black House. 2 months after the bankruptcy proceedings concluded, Donald MacLeish had walked into the sea near Fort William and drowned himself. He left behind a widow and a 15-year-old daughter named Morag. Hamish sat back from his laptop, feeling the weight of understanding settle over him. Morag hadn't just killed Julian Vane. She'd killed her family's destroyer, the son of the man who'd driven her father to suicide and stolen her heritage. The question was how to prove it without destroying what little evidence he had, and more pressingly, how to establish that she'd actually been at the Black House that night, when everyone seemed to have an alibi or lack thereof in equal measure. He was contemplating this over his morning porridge when Jimmy Anderson rang. "Blair's charging Archie this afternoon," Jimmy said without preamble. "The superintendent's pressuring him to close the case. I thought you'd want to know." "Can you stall him?" "With what?" "The man's convinced he's got the right suspect. The boot prints match, Archie had motive, and Blair's stopped listening to reason." "What if I could give you the real killer?" There was a pause. "How solid is your evidence?" "Circumstantial, but building. I need another 12 hours. I can give you 6. After that, Blair files the charges and Archie's going to trial." Hamish thanked him and rang off. 6 hours. He needed to move quickly. His first stop was the Heritage Centre, a small stone building that smelled of old paper and lavender polish. Morag was there, as he'd known she would be, cataloguing documents at her desk with the same gentle efficiency she brought to everything. "Hamish," she said, looking up with her perpetual smile. "What brings you here so early?" "Just tying up some loose ends," he said casually. "I was wondering, Mrs. Menzies, how well did you know the Black House before it became a heritage site?" "Only from local history," she replied smoothly. "Why do you ask?" "I noticed you have keys. For the maintenance, I suppose?" "Of course. Someone has to keep the place tidy. It's important to preserve our history, don't you think?" "Aye," said Hamish, watching her carefully. "Very important. Were you there the night Vane died?" Her hands stilled on the documents just for a moment. "I was at home, Hamish. Alone, unfortunately, so I can't prove it. But I had no reason to be at the Black House after dark." "No reason at all," agreed Hamish pleasantly. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Menzies." He left her there, surrounded by her carefully preserved papers, and drove to the Tommel Castle Hotel. The receptionist confirmed that Julian Vane had left at 9:30 on the night of his death, mentioning he planned to walk to the Black House for one final inspection. "Did he seem worried about anything?" Hamish asked. "Not worried exactly, more excited. He said something about having uncovered something interesting in the property records, said it would make his report very profitable indeed." So Vane had discovered something about the Black House's history, something he planned to use no doubt for another round of blackmail. Hamish's next stop was Angus MacDonald's cottage, where he found the old seer in his usual position by the fire, looking annoyingly prophetic. "I need information about the MacLeish family," Hamish said, dispensing with pleasantries. "Ah," said Angus, nodding wisely. "The spirits have been whispering about old sorrows." "The spirits or your cousin in Fort William?" Angus cackled. "Same difference. Aye, I knew Donald MacLeish. Good man, destroyed by a London shark. His widow moved away after he died, took the girl with her. Never heard what became of them." "The girl was Morag. Was she now?" Angus's rheumy eyes sharpened. "That's interesting, very interesting indeed." "What can you tell me about the night Vane died?" "I can tell you that I saw Morag Menzies walking toward the Black House around 10:30 that evening. I was out checking my sheep, and I saw her clear as day. Or as clear as you can see anything in that cursed fog. She was carrying something, looked like a basket." "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Nobody asked, and I didn't think much of it at the time. Thought maybe she was bringing the man some supper, trying to make peace. She's always been the peacemaking type." Hamish felt excitement surge through him. "Would you be willing to testify to that?" "Aye, if it comes to it. Though I'd prefer not to. The spirits don't like courtrooms." "I'm sure they'll manage," said Hamish dryly. He spent the next 2 hours systematically checking and double-checking every alibi. The Curry sisters had been watching a television programme that had indeed aired that night. The Reverend Wellington confirmed once again that Dr. Brodie had been at cards, with a brief absence around 11. Archie's alibi remained shaky but believable, and Morag Menzies, the helpful village archivist, had no alibi at all. By early afternoon, Hamish had assembled a timeline that made horrible sense. Morag had gone to the Black House around 10:30, as Angus had witnessed. She'd known Vane would be there, probably because she'd overheard him mention it at the hotel, or been told by someone else. She'd brought a basket, as she always did, the perfect excuse for her presence. She'd confronted Vane about what he'd discovered, about her true identity and her family's history with his father. And when he'd threatened to expose her, or perhaps simply mocked her the way he mocked everyone, she'd struck him down with a heavy peat cutter. The locked door was the final piece of brilliance. She'd bolted it from inside, then slipped out through some method Hamish still hadn't determined, making the murder look impossible and therefore deflecting suspicion. But the vellum and adhesive had betrayed her. The materials she worked with every day, the tools of her trade, had left traces that connected her to the crime. Hamish sat in his office looking at his notes. He had motive, opportunity, and physical evidence. What he didn't have was proof of how she had escaped the locked room. He picked up the phone and called Jimmy Anderson. "I need you to bring Blair to the Black House at 5 o'clock, and bring Morag Menzies too. Tell her we need her expertise on some historical detail." "Hamish, what are you planning?" "I'm going to solve your murder case, Jimmy, and I'm going to do it in a way that lets Blair take all the credit. You're a strange man." "Hamish Macbeth." "Aye," said Hamish, "but I'm a lazy one who likes his quiet life, and the best way to keep it quiet is to let Blair have his glory." He hung up and looked at Luggs, who was watching him with doleful eyes. "Time to catch a killer, boy," he said, "and maybe save an innocent fisherman while we're at it." Luggs thumped his tail in approval. It was, after all, what Hamish did best. Chapter 8. The Librarian's Flaw. The Black House at 5 o'clock in the afternoon was a grim affair, all shadows and cold stone and the lingering memory of violence. Blair arrived in typically bombastic fashion, his bulk filling the doorway as he glared at Hamish with undisguised suspicion. "This had better be good, Macbeth. I've got a press conference scheduled for 6 o'clock to announce the charges against McCloughan." "I think you'll want to postpone that, sir," said Hamish mildly. Behind Blair came Jimmy Anderson, looking curious and cautious in equal measure. And finally Morag Menzies, still carrying one of her ubiquitous baskets and wearing an expression of gentle concern. "I'm not sure how I can help," she said softly, "but of course I'll do whatever I can." "I appreciate that, Mrs. Menzies," said Hamish. "I wanted to go over the timeline one more time, and I thought your knowledge of the Black House might be useful," Blair snorted. "Timeline's already established. Vane arrived at 9:30, McLean killed him sometime before midnight, then locked the door to throw us off the scent." "That's the problem with that theory, sir," said Hamish. "The door was bolted from the inside, which means either Archie McLean is a master magician or someone else was here." "Get to the point, Macbeth." Hamish walked to the centre of the room where the bloodstain still marked the earthen floor. Julian Vane discovered something in the property records, something that made him excited about his final report. "Mrs. Menzies, you've been maintaining the archives here for years. What would the most interesting discovery about this building be?" Morag's smile never wavered. "I suppose the original ownership would be of interest. The Black House belonged to the MacLeish family for generations before it was sold to pay debts." "Sold to Geoffrey Vane," said Hamish quietly, "Julian's father." Something flickered in Morag's eyes, there and gone so quickly that Hamish almost missed it. "I wouldn't know about that," she said. "It was long before my time." "Was it?" Hamish pulled out his phone and displayed a scanned photograph. "This is Donald MacLeish and his daughter Morag, taken in 1984. That's you, isn't it, Mrs. Menzies? Or should I say, Mrs. MacLeish?" The gentle smile froze on her face like ice forming on a pond. Blair pushed forward, squinting at the photograph. "What's this about?" "Morag Menzies changed her name from Morag MacLeish in 2002, said Hamish. 20 years after her father lost this house to Geoffrey Vane's fraud and killed himself. She's been living in Lochdoub all these years, waiting. And when Julian Vane came to destroy her family's heritage a second time, she stopped him." "This is ridiculous," said Morag, but her voice had lost its softness. "You have no proof of any of this." "Actually I do," said Hamish. He produced the evidence bag containing the scrap of vellum. "This was found wedged in the doorframe. It's the same archival vellum you use at the Heritage Centre, and the adhesive on it matches the residue found on the murder weapon." Jimmy Anderson stepped closer, examining the evidence with professional interest. "That could be from any time," Morag protested. I've been maintaining this building for years. Of course my materials would be here." "Aye," agreed Hamish, "except this particular piece was fresh. The adhesive hadn't fully dried, and it was caught in a spot that suggests it was used very recently, probably on the night of the murder." "This is all speculation," said Morag, but her hands had tightened on her basket. Hamish continued, his voice still mild but relentless. "You were seen walking toward the Black House at 10:30 on the night Vane died, carrying a basket just like the one you've got now. Always the same, always helpful Mrs. Menzies bringing food to people." "Who saw me?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. "A witness who's willing to testify. You came here to confront Vane about what he'd discovered. Maybe you hoped to reason with him, to appeal to some decency he didn't have. But he mocked you, didn't he? Threatened to expose your identity, your father's shame. Maybe even threatened to use it against you the way he used everything against everyone." Morag's face had gone pale, but she said nothing. Blair, for once, was listening with something approaching intelligence. How'd she get out with the door locked? Hamish had been working on this problem for hours, examining the building's structure, its history, its secrets. And finally he'd found it. "Mrs. Menzies, how many original features does the Black House retain from when your family lived here?" "Most of them," she said automatically, then caught herself. "Including," said Hamish, walking to the hearth, "the traditional Highland hidey-hole." He knelt down and pressed a specific stone in the hearth's base. With a grinding sound, a section of the back wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. Jimmy Anderson whistled. "Well, I'll be damned." "Priest holes weren't just English," said Hamish. "Highland families had their own hiding places for valuables, for fugitives during the clearances. This one leads to a natural cave in the hillside behind the building. The opening's hidden by gorse bushes. You'd never find it unless you knew it was there." And she knew it was there, said Blair, his face brightening with the realization that he was about to solve a high-profile murder case. Her family built this house, said Hamish. She grew up here. She knew every secret of these walls. After she killed Vane, she bolted the door from inside, escaped through the passage and closed it behind her. The perfect locked room. Morag stood very still, her basket hanging from her arm, her face composed but her eyes dark with something that might have been anger or grief, or both. The list you gave D.C. E. Blair, Hamish continued gently. It was too perfect, too detailed. You were steering the investigation toward the other villagers, protecting yourself. And then there was the threatening note allegedly written by Archie. When I examined it closely, the handwriting was just slightly too neat, too deliberate. A forgery, and not a very good one. I don't know what you're talking about, said Morag, but her voice had gone flat. There's also the matter of the historical deed you mentioned to Blair, the one you said Vane was researching. But that deed was destroyed in a fire in 1976. The only person who would know that is the village archivist. You were so busy being helpful that you outsmarted yourself. Blair had his phone out now, calling for backup. Morag Menzies, I'm arresting you for the murder of Julian Vane. You don't have to say anything. I know my rights, Morag interrupted. She turned to Hamish, and for the first time he saw the steel beneath the gentle facade. You're very clever, Constable Macbeth. But you know what's interesting? I don't regret it. That man was a monster, just like his father. He destroyed my family once, and he was going to destroy this village next. Someone had to stop him. That wasn't your decision to make, said Hamish quietly. Wasn't it? Her smile was bitter now, nothing gentle about it. My father killed himself because of the Vanes. I've spent 20 years preserving what was left of my family's history, protecting this place, and Julian Vane was going to turn it into a glamping pod for rich tourists. Tell me, Constable, what would you have done? Hamish didn't answer. He didn't need to. The uniformed constables arrived and led Morag away. She went quietly with dignity, her basket still on her arm. As she passed Hamish, she paused. Thank you for not making a spectacle of it, she said. I suppose that's something. Then she was gone, and Blair was already on his phone with the press office, rewriting his statement to announce the arrest of the real killer. Jimmy Anderson sidled up to Hamish. You know he's going to take all the credit. Aye, said Hamish, I'm counting on it. You're a strange man. Hamish Macbeth. So I've been told. Hamish left them to their evidence gathering and press conferences and drove back through the gathering darkness to his police station. Luggs greeted him with enthusiasm, and Sonsie deigned to acknowledge his return with a slow blink. He made himself a cup of tea and sat down by the fire, feeling the weight of the case lift from his shoulders. Tomorrow Blair would announce his brilliant detective work. The superintendent would congratulate him. The newspapers would run headlines about the dramatic arrest, and Hamish Macbeth would remain a lazy Highland constable who'd done nothing of consequence. Exactly as he preferred it. Chapter 9, Sins of the Past. The village of Lochdoub reacted to Morag Menzies' arrest the way a family reacts to discovering that the sweet maiden aunt is actually a jewel thief, with shock, disbelief, and a certain guilty fascination. The Curry sisters were scandalised. Morag Menzies, a murderess, said Nessie, her knitting needles clicking with agitation. A murderess, echoed Jessie, dropping a stitch, and we took tea with her every Wednesday. Every Wednesday? Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, was more pragmatic. Well, I can't say I'm entirely surprised. There was always something too perfect about her helpfulness. Nobody's that nice all the time. The Reverend Wellington, who believed in Christian charity even when it was inconvenient, reserved judgment. We should pray for her soul, he said. Whatever she's done, she deserves our compassion. Dr. Brodie, relieved beyond measure that suspicion had shifted away from his late-night visit to the Black House, bought a round at the pub in celebration. Archie MacLean, released from custody with Blair's grudging apologies, retreated to his harbour shed to avoid his wife's pointed comments about how she'd told him all along that he was innocent. Hamish watched it all with the detached amusement of a man who'd seen Highland Village's process scandal before. They'd gossip for a few weeks, then move on to the next drama. It was the way of things. What he hadn't expected was the telephone call from Jimmy Anderson 2 days after Morag's arrest. "She's asking to speak to you," Jimmy said. "Won't talk to Blair, won't talk to her solicitor. Says she'll only explain everything to you. Why me? God knows. Maybe because you didn't gloat. Maybe because you're the only one who actually solved the case instead of blundering about like Blair. Will you come?" Hamish considered refusing. The case was closed, Blair had his glory, and Hamish had his quiet life back. Getting further involved served no purpose, but curiosity, that most dangerous of Highland traits, got the better of him. "I'll be there this afternoon," he said. The interview room at Strathbane Station was painted in the sort of institutional green that suggested whoever chose it had a grudge against human happiness. Morag sat at the metal table, looking smaller somehow without her basket and her gentle smile. She'd aged 10 years in 2 days. "Thank you for coming," she said when Hamish entered. Her voice was still soft, but the soothing quality had gone out of it. "Jimmy said you wanted to talk. I wanted to explain. Not to excuse what I did, but to explain. I think I owe you that much." Hamish sat down across from her and waited. Morag folded her hands on the table, studying them as if they belonged to someone else. "My father was a good man, honest, hard-working, devoted to our family and our heritage. The Black House had been in the MacLeish family for 200 years. We weren't wealthy, but we had our history, our place in the world." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Geoffrey Vane came to the Highlands in 1984 with plans to develop the land around Loch Dubh. He needed local partners, people who knew the area and had connections. My father was flattered. A London businessman wanting to work with a Highland crofter. He thought it was an opportunity to secure our future. He didn't know what Vane was really after, said Hamish. No, and by the time he realised it was too late. Vane had structured the partnership so that everything was in my father's name. When the development failed, deliberately failed, I found out later my father was liable for all the debts. Vane walked away clean. We lost everything. Her voice remained steady, but Hamish could see her knuckles whitening. My father tried to fight it in court, but Vane had expensive lawyers and connections. We had nothing. The Black House was sold at auction for a fraction of its value. Geoffrey Vane bought it himself, added insult to injury. 2 months later, my father walked into the sea. "I'm sorry," said Hamish, meaning it. My mother and I moved away. Fort William, then Edinburgh. She died 5 years later. Heart failure, the doctors said, but I knew better. She died of grief and shame. I was 20 then, alone in the world, with nothing but my name and the memory of what the Vanes had done to my family. So you changed your name and came back? Not immediately. I spent 15 years working, studying, making myself useful. I trained as an archivist, learned everything I could about preservation and history. And then, when I was ready, I came back to Loch Dubh as Morag Menzies. Nobody remembered the MacLeish girl. I was just another helpful widow looking for a quiet place to live. "And you became indispensable," said Hamish. "The perfect neighbour, the perfect volunteer." "I wanted to protect the Black House," said Morag simply. "I couldn't own it, but I could care for it, keep it as my father would have wanted. It became my life's work. Until Julian Vane arrived." Her expression hardened. He was worse than his father. At least Geoffrey had the excuse of simple greed. Julian enjoyed the cruelty. When he started researching the property records, I knew he'd discover the connection eventually, and he did. What did he say when he found out? He laughed. The words came out bitter. He actually laughed, said it was poetic justice, the MacLeish daughter serving as caretaker for what used to be the MacLeish home. He said he'd mention it in his report, make it part of the glamping pod's marketing. Stay in a house stolen from a suicide's family. He thought it would add authenticity. Hamish felt a wave of distaste for the dead man, even murdered. Julian Vane managed to inspire loathing. "I went to the Black House that night to beg him not to," Morag continued. I thought maybe if I explained, if I appealed to some shred of decency. But there was no decency in him. He told me I should be grateful they'd let the building stand at all instead of tearing it down. Said my father was a fool who deserved what he got. And you struck him. I didn't plan to. I swear I didn't. But the peat cutter was there, and he was sneering at me. And I thought of my father walking into the sea and my mother dying of a broken heart, and 20 years of pretending to be someone else just to stay close to my family's home. And I struck him. She looked at Hamish directly for the first time, her eyes dry but haunted. He died instantly. I checked. There was no suffering. And then I stood there in the dark in my family's house with the man who would have destroyed it lying dead at my feet, and I felt nothing. No guilt, no horror, just relief. And then you bolted the door and escaped through the priest hole. My father showed me that passage when I was 8 years old, told me it was our family's secret to be used only in the direst emergency. I think he'd be pleased to know it served one last purpose. Hamish sat back, processing the story. It was exactly as he'd suspected, but hearing it laid out in Morag's quiet voice made it more real, more human. Why are you telling me this? He asked. Because you'll understand, she said. You're a Highland man, Constable Macbeth. You know about family and heritage and what it means to belong to a place. Blair wouldn't understand. The lawyers won't understand, but you do. Understanding doesn't change what happened, said Hamish gently. You killed a man. I know, and I'll pay for it. But I wanted someone to know why. Not the official version that'll come out in court, but the real story. The truth about the Vanes and the MacLeishes and a house that stood for 200 years despite everything. She stood up, signalling the interview was over. Thank you for listening, Hamish Macbeth, and thank you for solving it the way you did. You could have made it ugly and public. Instead, you let me keep what little dignity I had left. I'm sorry it came to this, Mrs. Menzies. So am I, she said, but not for the reasons you might think. The guard came to take her back to her cell. Hamish watched her go, and feeling the complicated weight of justice and mercy and the sins of the past. Outside, the Highland winter was finally releasing its grip. The first hints of spring were visible in the lengthening days and the slightly less murderous wind. Hamish drove back to Lochdu, where Lugs and Sonsey and his peaceful life were waiting. The case was closed, the village would heal, and Hamish Macbeth would remain exactly where he wanted to be, as far from promotion as possible. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. Spring came to Lochdu the way it always did, reluctantly and with considerable grumbling, as if the Highland winter was annoyed at being asked to leave. The freezing fog lifted, replaced by cold rain that was somehow less malevolent. The peat moors turned from treacherous ice fields into merely soggy bogs. Hamish's sheep ventured out of their shelter and immediately regretted it. Life, in other words, returned to normal. Hamish was in his kitchen, making breakfast for Lugs and Sonsey while contemplating the pleasant emptiness of his day, when the telephone rang. It was Jimmy Anderson, sounding uncharacteristically cheerful. Thought you'd want to know, the superintendent's promoting Blair to detective superintendent. Big ceremony next week, he's over the moon. Good for him, said Hamish, sost meaning it. A promoted Blair was a Blair too busy with administrative nonsense to bother Hamish. The superintendent also mentioned you, said that while you hadn't exactly distinguished yourself in the investigation, you'd been adequately competent in supporting Blair's brilliant detective work. Adequate competence, said Hamish with satisfaction. That's exactly what I was aiming for, Jimmy laughed. You're the only copper in Scotland who celebrates being called adequate. Anyway, there's something else. Morag Menzies' solicitor has been in touch. She's pleading guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Given the circumstances, her age, and her previously spotless record, they're expecting a reduced sentence. Maybe 8 to 10 years. That's something at least. More than she deserves. According to Blair. But then Blair's never met a sentence he didn't think was too lenient. Jimmy paused. She asked me to thank you. Said you treated her with respect when you didn't have to. After Jimmy rang off, Hamish stood at his window, looking out at the village. The Black House stood on its hill, dark against the grey sky, waiting. The Heritage Board had decided to keep it open, though they were considering closing the priest hole passage for safety reasons. Hamish suspected Morag would find some bitter humour in that. He was still standing there when he saw a familiar figure approaching the police station. Detective Chief Inspector Blair, looking unusually purposeful. Hamish braced himself for whatever unpleasantness was coming and opened the door before Blair could start hammering on it. "Constable Macbeth," said Blair, his face redder than usual from the walk up the hill. "A word, if you please." "Come in, sir. Tea?" "No tea. This won't take long." Blair settled himself in Hamish's best chair with the air of a man preparing to deliver a speech. "I wanted to speak to you about the Vane case." Here it comes, thought Hamish. Some new way to claim even more credit. But Blair surprised him. "I know what you did," Blair said bluntly. "Jimmy Anderson's got a loose tongue when he's had a few drams, and he let slip that you'd been feeding him information throughout the investigation. Said you'd spotted the discrepancies in Morag Menzies' story, found the evidence in the Black House, worked out the whole locked room business." Hamish said nothing, waiting. "And you let me take the credit," Blair continued. "Deliberately steered me to make the arrest myself so I'd look good to the superintendent." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, sir." Blair leaned forward, his small eyes sharp. "Don't play games with me, Macbeth. I'm not a complete fool, whatever you might think. I know you solved that case, just like you've solved half the cases in the Highlands over the past decade while I've been taking the glory. If you say so, sir. The question is why? Why do you do it? You could have made superintendent yourself by now if you'd claimed credit for your work. Instead, you hide in this backwater, pretending to be lazy, letting idiots like me advance while you feed your sheep." Hamish looked at Blair, really looked at him, and saw something he hadn't expected. Not anger or suspicion, but genuine bewilderment. Blair honestly couldn't understand why anyone would choose peace over promotion. "I like it here, sir," Hamish said simply. "I like my village, my animals, my quiet life. I don't want to be superintendent. I don't want to sit in an office in Strathbane dealing with paperwork and politics. I just want to be left alone to keep the peace in Lochdubh." "You're mad," said Blair, but there was something almost like respect in his voice. "Aye, maybe I am." Blair stood up, brushing off his trousers. "Well, I won't pretend to understand it, but I wanted you to know that I know, and—" He paused as if the words were being dragged out of him with pliers. "I appreciate it. The helping without the credit taking, it's unusual." "You're welcome, sir. Don't let it go to your head, Macbeth. You're still the laziest constable in Scotland." "I do my best, sir." After Blair left, Hamish sat down with a cup of tea and a feeling of profound satisfaction. Blair knew, but Blair would never tell, because admitting that Hamish had solved his cases would mean admitting he hadn't solved them himself. It was the perfect arrangement. The rest of the day passed in pleasant idleness. Hamish fed his sheep, checked on the village, had a pint at the pub where Archie McLean bought him a drink in thanks for proving his innocence. The Curry sisters cornered him on the street to provide their latest theories about Morag's character, which Hamish accepted with appropriate solemnity. As evening fell, he walked down to the loch, lugs trotting beside him and Sonsie stalking through the heather on some private hunting expedition. The water was dark and still, reflecting the first stars. The village lights twinkled in the gathering dusk. Hamish thought about Morag Menzies, locked in a cell in Strathbane, paying for her crime. He thought about Julian Vane, who had died as he'd lived, creating misery. He thought about the Black House standing empty on its hill, keeping its secrets. Justice, he reflected, was a complicated business. The law said Morag was a murderer and should be punished. But Highland justice, the old kind that ran deeper than statutes and courtrooms, said that sometimes wrongs had to be balanced, that cruelty deserved consequences, that family and heritage mattered. He didn't know which was right. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. What he did know was that Lochdubh was at peace again. The village had weathered another storm, or absorbed another tragedy, and would continue on as it always had. People would gossip and quarrel and help each other through the long Highland winters. Life would go on, and Hamish Macbeth would be here to watch over it all, lazy and content and exactly where he wanted to be. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at the police station. It was from Morag, written in her neat archivist's hand. "Dear Hamish," it read, "I wanted you to know that I've arranged for something in my will. The small savings I have will go to maintaining the Black House in perpetuity. Perhaps that's vanity, wanting to ensure my family's home survives even after I'm gone. But I think my father would approve. Thank you for treating me like a person rather than a monster. I don't expect forgiveness, but I appreciate your kindness. Regards, Morag Menzies." Hamish folded the letter carefully and put it in his desk drawer. Then he went outside, where the spring sun was making a rare appearance, warming the village and turning the loch from black to a deep, welcoming blue. Lugs barked at a passing seagull. Sonsy stretched in a patch of sunlight. The Curry sisters walked by, arguing about something incomprehensible. Dr. Brodie drove past in his battered car, raising a hand in greeting. The Reverend Wellington emerged from the church carrying a fishing rod and looking faintly guilty. Lochdoub, his village, his responsibility, his home. Hamish Macbeth smiled, scratched Lugs behind the ears, and went back inside to put the kettle on. Life, he thought, was good, and it would stay that way as long as he remained adequately competent and properly lazy, which suited him just fine. The end.